It's 1944. A Royal Air Force reconnaissance pilot is cruising at 30,000 feet over southern Germany. Clear skies, routine run. He's done this dozens of times. Then something crosses his field of view. Not above him, not below him, through him, past him, gone. He radios back to base. They ask him to describe it. He says, no propellers, no piston noise, just a shape, moving faster than anything I've ever seen. His debrief report was qualified under unconfirmed sightings. Back at the airfield, someone took that report out of the file, read it very carefully and said, they've done it. Here's the thing about that moment. We are talking about the Me-262 as a German weapon, a piece of engineering, a footnote in a war that was already decided. But that's the wrong frame entirely. Because the question worth asking, the one nobody really answers, is this. How does an aircraft designed in 1938, built with desperate wartime compromises by engineers who had never built a jet before, still influence how fighter jets are designed today? We'll get to that, but first, let's go back to the beginning. Warrior&Steel is military history told with rigor, with real sources and with a visual identity we are generally proud of. Every video covers one machine, a vehicle, an aircraft, a weapon, and tells you the full story, the engineering, the people, the decision, the mistakes. History you can study, design you can wear. Welcome, let's get into it. Meet the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. An aircraft that entered combat in 1944, the same year the Allies were landing on the beaches of Normandy, the same year Germany was already losing, and somehow, was faster than anything the Allies could put it in the sky. The Me-262 didn't just win dogfights, it redefined what a dogfight could be. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to. This plane should not have worked. The engines failed constantly. The fuel burned in under an hour. Hitler himself tried to turn it into a bomber. Half the pilots who flew it had barely trained on it. It had every reason to be a disaster, and it wasn't. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why, and you will understand why, more than 8 years later, the solution Messerschmitt engineers improvised under impossible pressure are still standard on modern fighters. To understand the Me-262, you have to understand where it came from and when. The year is 1938. Germany is rearming at a pace that alarms everyone who's paying attention, and at Messerschmitt design offices in Augsburg, an engineer named Waldemar Voigt is catching something unusual, not an RBF-109 variant, something with no propellers at all. The Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry, has issued a quiet specification, a twin-engine jet-powered fighter. The project gets a number, P1065. Nobody thinks it will be ready anytime soon. At this point, jet engines are laboratory curiosities. Then the war starts, and suddenly there's no time for unusual. The problem is this. By 1942, the Luftwaffe, which had been the most feared air force in the world just 3 years earlier, is starting to crack. The Eastern Front is bleeding it dry, and over Germany itself, something terrifying is happening. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and British Lancasters are appearing in the sky in their hundreds. Daylight raids, night raids, wave after wave. The Bf-109s and the Focke-Wulf 190s, as good as they were, couldn't climb fast enough, couldn't fly high enough, and couldn't catch them before the bombs fell. The jet fighter wasn't a luxury anymore, it was lifeline. But then something almost unbelievable happened. In 1940, right at the moment Germany needed every technological edge it could find, Hermann Göring cut funding to jet engine research. His reasoning, the war would be over before any jet could matter. It's one of the most expensive wrong calls in the history of aviation, and the Me-262 program paid for it in years of delay. The first prototype, the V1, was finally completed in spring 1941, but the BMW jet engines that were supposed to power it weren't ready. So Messerschmitt test pilot Fritz Wendel flew it with a piston engine bolted to the nose, just to see if the airframe worked. It did. Beautiful, in fact. By July 18, 1942, Wendel finally took off from Leipheim under pure jet power, 2 Junkers U-Mod 004 engines, no propeller, 12 minutes in the air. When he landed, he said, "My jet engines run like clockwork. It was a pure joy to fly this new machine." The future had arrived. It just had no idea how much trouble it was about to cause. Let's get into the machine itself. Everything about the Me-262 starts with the engines, because without understanding them, nothing else makes sense. The Me-262 was powered by 2 Junkers U-Mod 004B turbojets, mounted in pods under the wings. Each one produced around 880 kilograms of thrust, roughly 8.8 kilonewtons, and unlike the British jet engines being developed at the same time, which used a centrifugal compressor design, the UMO-004 was axial flow, air compressed in a straight line through 8 stages. That matters, because axial flow engines are inherently more efficient and produce less drag. They are also the design every modern jet engine in the world uses today. The UMO-004 was conceptually correct. The problem was the materials. Germany in 1944 was running out of critical metals, chromium, nickel, the alloys you need to survive the temperature inside a turbine. So the engineers at Junkers improvised. Turbine blades were coated with aluminum foil over mild steel. It worked, just barely, but it meant that the engines had a service life of around 20 to 50 hours before they needed to be overhauled or replaced. 20 to 50 hours. A modern jet engine is rated for thousands. And they were temperamental. Throttle up too fast and the compressor was sold. Push the engine too hard in a turn and one could flame out, shut off in flight, leaving you asymmetric with one engine gun at combat speeds. The pilot's manual had a specific instruction: accelerate gradually. Every Me-262 pilot had to learn a kind of patience that felt completely wrong when someone was shooting at you. The airframe was aluminum semi-monocoque, a stressed skin design which was standard for the air, but what wasn't standard was the swept wing. The Me-262 wings were swept back at approximately 18.5 degrees along the leading edge. This wasn't originally an aerodynamic decision, it was a balance fix. Moving the engines aboard under swept wings shifted the center of gravity backward, solving a weight distribution problem. But it had an intended side effect, a very useful one. Swept wings delayed the onset of compressibility effects, the shock waves that build up as an aircraft approaches the speed of sound. At the speeds the Me-262 was flying, this mattered enormously. In a dive, the aircraft could reach Mach 0.84 or 0.86, nearly 1000 km per hour, before the buffeting and loss of control started. The swept wing was an accident that became a revelation. After the war, North American aviation, designers of the F-86 Sabre, studied German aerodynamics research extensively. The Sabre's swept wings owes a direct debt to what Voigt teams discovered, largely by accident, on the Me-262. And then there were the leading edge slats, small panels along the wing's front edge that automatically extended at low speeds. They prevented the wing from stalling in slow flight, giving the pilot more controllability during the critical moments of takeoff and landing. Those same slats, in nearly identical form, appear on the F-86. Top speed in level flight approximately 870 km at 6,000 meters. In some conditions, pilots reported 900 km per hour. The fastest light piston fighters, the P-51D Mustang, the Spitfire Mach 14, topped at around 700-720 km per hour. The Me-262 was 150 to 200 km per hour faster than anything the lights had in the air. That is not a small margin, that is the different category of aircraft entirely. The only light jet in service at the time, the British Gloster Meteor, reached around 800 km per hour in its Mark III configuration, still slower. Here's a detail that sounds minor but changed everything: the tricycle nose wheel. Early prototypes used a tailwheel configuration, the standard of the era. The problem was that, during takeoff roll, the jet exhaust hit the horizontal tail surface at an unhelpful angle, robbing the pilot of pitch authority. Fritz Wendel's solution for the first pure jet takeoff was to briefly tap the brakes at around 180 km per hour to kick the tail up. It worked, but it was also insane. The tricycle gear fixed this properly. Aircraft sits level on the ground, pilot has full elevator authority from the start of the roll. Takeoff distances drops dramatically. 4 Mauser Mark 108 cannons 30mm, all in the nose, 2 upper, 2 lower. The upper had 100 rounds each, the lowers 80. The Mark 108 was not a precision instrument, it had a muzzle velocity of around 540 meters per second, slow for a cannon, which gave it a narrowing, dropping trajectory that made it generally difficult to use against maneuvering targets. But against a B-17 Flying Fortress, 3 hits was enough to bring one down, a single hit could destroy a fighter. The math on firepower is almost absurd. 4 Mark 108s firing together could deliver 45 kilograms of projectile per second. For comparison, a contemporary British Hawker Tempest with 4 20mm Hispano cannons delivered around 18 kg per second. The Me-262 wasn't armed like a fighter, it was armed like an executioner. Late in the war, pilots also carried R4M Orkan rockets, 24 of them, 12 under each wing, 55mm guided rockets with folding fins, launching salvos of 6 or 12 from about 1,000 meters out. A single salvo could saturate an area the size of a bomber's wingspan. First used operationally in March 1945, devastatingly effective. Introduced 6 months too late to matter. I want to tell you about Adolf Galland. If you know one name from the German fighter pilot tradition of the Second World War, it might be his. By 1943, Galland had over 100 victories. He was general of the fighter arm, the most senior fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe. He had the ear of Goering and sometimes reluctantly of Hitler himself. He had also, by 1943, been watching the Luftwaffe lose the air war over Germany, one formation at a time. On May 22, 1943, Galland was invited to fly a prototype Me-262, the V4. He had been skeptical. He was a piston pilot, a dogfighter, a man who had built his career on aircraft that responded to every input immediately. The jet was supposed to be temperamental, underpowered during acceleration, difficult on takeoff and landing. His colleagues had warned him. He climbed in anyway. What happened next, Galland described afterwards with a single sentence. Es ist also oben angeschiebt. It is if an angel is pushing. That wasn't hyperbole. That was a man trying to find words for something he didn't have words for. The acceleration of a jet engine is categorically different from a piston aircraft. There's no vibration, no torque pulling the nose, no mechanical clattering. It's smooth, continuous, building force, like gravity except sideways. Galland landed and immediately began pushing for full operational deployment. He later wrote that it was a stroke of a genius that would guarantee us an unimaginable advantage if the enemy stayed on pistons. He was right. And then the politics started. The first problem was Hitler himself. In June 1944, Hitler saw the Me-262 demonstrated and became fixated on a single idea. He wanted a fast bomber, a blitz bomber, to strike at Allied ground forces. Not an interceptor, not a dogfighter, a bomb carrier. His generals tried to explain. Galland tried to explain. The aircraft was not designed to carry bombs. Converting it would require structural modification, would reduce performance, would delay deployment of desperately needed interceptor by months. Hitler didn't want to hear it. He ordered that every Me-262 be produced and configured as a bomber. Everyone. The production lines were modified. Bomb racks were bolted on. 2 of the 4 cannons were removed to compensate for weight. And the air over Germany, where American B-17s were flying in formation of 1,000, went uncontested by the one aircraft that might have made the difference. The delay, by most estimates, was around 6 months. 6 months in a war where every week counted. Eventually, after enormous pressure from Galland and other commanders, the order was quietly walked back. Me-262s began flying as interceptors in earnest by late autumn 1944, and in there they were exactly as advertised. The Jagdgeschwader 7, the first full jet fighter wing in history, was operational by December 1944. Galland himself would later form Jagdverband 44, a unit of elite volunteer aces, flying Me-262s out of Munich Rhine in the final weeks of the war. It has been described as the most talented collection of fighter pilots ever assembled in a single unit. They flew 16 aircraft, 16 jets, against the combined air forces of the United States and Britain. On March 18, 1945, 37 Me-262 of JG-7 intercepted an American formation over Berlin, 1,330 bombers, 700 fighter escorts. The jets flew through the escort too fast for the Mustang to catch, and hit the bombers from behind in shallow climbs, firing the Mark 108's cannons and the R4M rockets in passing attacks that lasted 2 seconds at most. That day, JG-7 claimed 12 bombers. American records confirmed 8 lost in the raid, plus 1 shot down by a friendly P-51 that panicked during the chaos. 8 heavy bombers from 37 jets in a single engagement. And for the B-17 crews, the psychological effect was something separate from numbers. These things were silent at approach. No engine sound warning, just a ship growing fast in the rear gunner's windows, already firing, already passed. The gunner's turret couldn't track something that fast. One tail gunner later said, "You couldn't do anything, you just waited to find out if it was your plane." Galland was shot down on April 26, 1945. A P-47 Thunderbolt caught his Me-262 at low speed, attacking a formation of bombers. He bailed out, wounded. He survived the war. JV-44 disbanded days later. The last confirmed Luftwaffe aerial victory of the Second World War, a Soviet Yak-9 shot down on May 8, 1945, hours before the German surrender, was claimed by a pilot of the 2nd Squad of JG-7, flying an Me-262. So, back to the question we are opened with. How does an aircraft designed in 1938, built under desperate wartime conditions, still influence modern fighters today? The honest answer is not because it won. It didn't win. The Me-262 was operationally available for less than a year. It flew outnumbered, perpetually short of fuel, with engines that wore out faster than they could be replaced, flown increasingly by pilots who hadn't had enough training. By the end of the war, fewer than 300 of the 1400 plus Me-262 built ever flew a combat mission. What it influenced was everyone who studied afterward. The swept wing, the axial flow engine architecture, the leading edge slots, the tricycle undercarriage, the concept of heavily armed, high-speed dedicated interceptor that doesn't need to outrun its opponent, it just needs to be faster. After the war, American engineers examined captured Me-262 at Wright Field. Soviet engineers got their own examples. The British flew several at Farnborough. Everyone took notes. The F-86 Sabre, the aircraft that defined Western power during the Korean War, shares direct DNA with the Me-262. The swept wing, the slot, the general philosophy. The MiG-15 it fought against, same story, through a different chain of inheritance. Every modern jet fighter flying today, in some conceptual sense, is the Me-262 with better materials, better engines, and 80 more years of refinement. That's the answer. Not that it changed the outcome of the war, it didn't. But it changed what came after, everything that came after. There's something worth sitting with here, beyond the aeronautics. The Me-262 is a story about what happens when a genuinely revolutionary idea encounters an institution that doesn't know what to do with it. The engineers who built it understood what they had. Galland understood what he had. The pilots who flew it, many of them on the first jet sortie, understood what they had the moment the engine spun up. But the system around them, the politics, the procurement decision, the generals who want a blitz bomber, the leadership that couldn't resist trying to use a scalpel as a hammer, kept finding ways to slow it down, redirect it, deploy it wrong. This isn't a specifically German failure. It's not a specifically wartime failure. It's what happens when the people controlling a technology don't understand it, and the people who understand it don't control it. You can find that story in aviation history. You can find it in every other industry. You can find it in your own organization if you look hard enough. The Me-262 didn't lose because it was outmatched in the air. On a head-to-head technical comparison in 1944, nothing in the Allies had could touch it. It lost because of decisions made on the ground, decisions made by people who were thinking about the last war while their engineers were building the next one. The Czechoslovak Air Force flew a Me-262 built locally by the Avia company from leftover components until 1951, long enough to see the MiG-15 arrive and make them obsolete almost overnight. That's the other part of the story. It's not just the Me-262 was a revolution, it's that the revolution started to move so fast that it consumed its own pioneers within a few years. That's what it means to be the first. If this is the kind of history you want more of, machines, the season, the engineering and the human stories underneath them, told properly, then follow Warrior&Steel on YouTube and Instagram. Every week a new machine, every machine a new story. We are just getting started. Galland was asked after the war what the Me-262 could have achieved if it had been deployed correctly, 18 months early in the numbers that were possible. He didn't give a triumphal answer. He said something quieter. He said, "We would have made the Allies pay a much higher price. Whether that price would have changed anything, I don't know. But we would have made them earn it." That's an honest answer. The Me-262 wasn't a war winner, it was a proof. A proof that one generation of technology can be so far ahead of everything around it that the only thing that stops it from dominating is the decision of the people holding the key. History you can study, design you can wear. See you on the next one.